Welcome to the Givo Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the Program Associate at Givo. Today we have Noa Shashar and Elisheva Karlbach joining us for a discussion about the book, The Marital Knot, Agunot in the Ashkenazi Realm, 1648 to 1850. And for those of you who do not know Givo, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. We are located in New York City, where our library and archive contain over 24 million documents and 400,000 books that have been collected during the 100 years of Givo's existence. And these resources are used by researchers from all around the world. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. I'm about to hand it over to our panelists, but first I want to tell you a bit more about them. Noa Shashar holds a PhD in Jewish history from Hebrew University and an MA in Jewish and Gender Studies from the Schechter Institute. She's a lecturer at Sapir Academic College and author of several books, including Vanished Men, Agunot in the Ashkenazi Realm, which was published in Hebrew in 2020, and Not on Bread Alone, which was published in 2015. And we also have Elisheva Karlbach joining us. She's a Salo Whitmire Barron Professor of Jewish History at Columbia University. She specializes in early modern Jewish history, focused on Jewish-Christian cultural intersections, tolerance, religious dissent, and Messianism. And her books include The Pursuit of Heresy, published in 1990, Divided Souls, published in 2000, and Palaces of Time, published in 2011. All right, thank you all for joining us, and Elisheva and Noa, take it away.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Julia. It's been too many years since I've seen Noa in person, so I'm really excited about this opportunity. I think we met over Pinkasim in the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem. And I'm really excited to hear you speak, Noa, about your wonderful new book. I want to just remind our audience that if something provokes you and you have a question, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. So first, let me congratulate Noa on her newly translated book, The Marital Knot, produced in a handsome edition by Brandeis University Press. Its subject is abandoned women, or you will nuance the subject for us, in early modern Ashkenaz, in Hebrew called Agunot, women whose marital knot had frayed, but not the ties that bound them to their husbands, which could not be dissolved completely, as Noa will explain, leaving them in a state of limbo. It is a rich and fascinating study, and when it first appeared in Hebrew, approximately a decade ago, is that correct?
The book appeared 4 years ago, but
4 years ago. Okay, so I'm remembering
a decade
the dissertation, I believe. It was pioneering in its use of rabbinic and communal sources to draw this chapter in Jewish social history and Jewish women's history. So I want to begin by asking you, Noa, what drew you to this fascinating subject? And it's a difficult one.
If I may, let me begin by thanking you, Elisheva, for agreeing to lead this discussion, not only for agreeing to lead it just before Pesach, but also for having encouraged me to rework my dissertation into a book many years ago. So what drew me to the subject? While I was working on my master's thesis, which focused on the role of Nida purity laws in the lives of Ashkenazi Jews, I noticed that Agunot, almost every compilation of responsa has at least one question that deals with Agunot. Then I read Glickel Hamel's book, and Glickel brings 2 stories of Agunot. And I realized I have to juxtapose the rabbinic presentations of Agunot with historical sources. I was wondering what it really meant to be an agunah during the early modern period, and this is how I began this study, working on this study.
So you were, in fact, able to marshal an absolutely incredible array of sources in order to present these women's lives and voices and dilemmas. So before we go into the arguments that you make in the book, could you tell us a little bit more about your sources, where you drew from in order to do this historical work?
Yes, so I'll speak about it more later, but I'll say I began with the responsa, and then I went everywhere. I sat for a year in archives, and the staff sometimes used to make fun of me because every time I found an agunah, I was so happy. And they said, oh, come on, this is a sad story. What are you so happy about? But, maybe I'll show the list of sources, or I'll, if I may, let me see. I'll try to share. Oops, sorry. Okay. So. Okay, so maybe I'll begin with the beginning for those of the people in the audience who haven't read the book, and then I'll get to the sources, Elisheva. Okay, so I think it'll be
Take it away. It's yours.
Easier that way. So let's begin with some basic definitions for the benefit of those who need them. Under Jewish law, marriage is a union freely entered into by both parties. However, its dissolution is permitted under only one of two circumstances: the death of one's spouse, or a divorce executed through a bill of divorce, in Hebrew, a get, given by a husband to his wife. Women whose husbands disappear without legally, meaning halachically, Jewish law, divorcing them, or have been found dead, but have not been identified according to Jewish law, or refuse to grant them a get, or are unqualified to give a get, are defined as agunot. This word literally means anchored women. Agunot plural, agunah singular. An agunah remains bound to her marriage and is forbidden to rewed until her husband is either found and grants a get or is proven dead beyond all doubt. If she does remarry before her previous marriage ended halachically, her children will be considered as bastards, mamzerim in Hebrew, which is a very harsh and problematic status in Jewish law. I use the term unchaining in the book and throughout this presentation, referring to a halakhic decision allowing an agunah to remarry. Now, before we talk about the arguments and the book structure, I'd like you to bear in mind that in general, Jewish societies valued marriage. So the category of agunot, which is the uniquely feminine category, is usually perceived as marginal within the Jewish society. However, as I hoped to show in the book, and let the readers judge if I succeeded in that, researching agunot and their complicated status sheds light on a variety of Jewish social institutions as well as on Jewish theoretical concepts. So the scope of the study, abandoned women are a universal phenomenon far from unique to the Jewish society. Since we have, Mishnaic and Talmudic discussions about agunot, it's fair to assume that such women existed in most historical Jewish societies. The scope of the study in the book, my study, is as follows. Geography-wise, we're talking about Ashkenaz as defined by the late Professor Jacob Katz from Lithuania in the east to Alsace in the west. Basically means Eastern, Central, and large parts of Western Europe. This is a wide realm in which different areas were governed by different legal systems during the period under discussion. Time-wise, we're talking about a period that begins in the aftermath of a 30 years war, at the time of the Khmelnytsky massacres, known as Praot Tachvetat, and ends before the great immigration to the Americas in the later part of the 19th century. It was an age of developing mercantilism in which Jews played an important role, and during this period, men at all levels of Jewish society in Ashkenaz were regularly absent from their homes for long periods. By the end of this period, the Enlightenment is underway, and so is Hasidism. With the great tensions these movements often engendered within family frameworks. These historical currents made Agunot or igun, meaning the situation of being chained into a marriage or in captivity, marriage captivity, that's sometimes used that way, a phenomenon that could result from normal as well as from extraordinary life circumstances. So the focal points of my book, and this relates to your question about the sources, which Elisheva, which I will get to in a minute. The focal points are four: the Agunot themselves, their husbands, the rabbis, mainly the ways they practiced the unchaining, the use they made or didn't make of halakhic options, and the Jewish communities of the time, their attitudes towards the situation of igun and the measures they did or didn't take to prevent it. So basically the objectives of the study are twofold. First, I wanted to fill in a lacuna in scholarship by presenting a comprehensive analysis of the circumstances Agunot faced. We're talking about description that illuminates the texture of life these women experienced, rather than a systematic statistic analysis, which, due to lack of sufficient sources, is not possible. The second is to re-examine the meta-narrative often presented by scholars of Jewish law and by historians, asserting that rabbis were inclined to unchain agunot, did all they could to relieve such women from their unfortunate situation, and were usually lenient in applying the halakhic rules to cases of agunot. And this brings us back to the sources. So first of all, it's important to say, well, you'll see my sources come in different assorted sizes, formats, languages, but it's important to say that the paucity of sources written by women, including Agunot, of course, is one of the difficulties in studies like this. We're forced to rely mainly on texts written by men, rabbis, and community officials for cases that affect primarily women's destinies or women's lives. So having said that, here's a partial list of the main kinds of sources I used. So the first, as I said, are responsa compilations, written usually in Hebrew by rabbis who lived in different places within the realm under discussion. So I analyzed 430 of those. Now I want to say something about this analysis. Responsa are basically legal negotiations. I mean, the rabbi receives a question and he starts answering him based on precedents and based on the halakhic sources. But I was interested, I mean, of course, naturally, I had to study the halakha, the Jewish law, the details that pertain to this situation. But my study isn't a history of the halakha. I do relate to specific aspects of the history of the halakha, but that wasn't my main interest. I was trying to find details about very mundane details, very prosaic details about the women the rabbis were relating to, about their stories. So my analysis of the responsa focused on this kind of information. And we'll get back to that, I assume, later. The second kind are rabbinic court records in Hebrew, Yiddish, and German. So there are quite a few such court records that have survived. They haven't been thoroughly researched yet. I think we're still at the beginning. I mean, it's been over a decade since I wrote my dissertation, but we're still at the beginning of researching these important records. And the Beit Din records, the rabbinic court records, date for the most part to the second half of the 18th century. The third kind are other communal records, such as the record book of the lay leaders, community ordinances, expense and income books, burial records. Those were written by community officials like the treasurer, the scribe, the sexton, shamash. And you can see here in the presentation, this is an image from a photo from one of the Altona Hamburg Wandsbek. This is 3 communities in Germany, the shamash, the sexton's book. This is from one of those. The fourth kind of documents are what we call ego documents, meaning letters, diaries, memoirs. Some of these were written by women, some by men. And it's not that we have plenty of those, but I did find a letter written by an agunah, which made me very happy. I mean, her story was terrible. She was miserable. But I was very happy to find such material and to bring her story, to be able to bring her story as she phrased it in her letter. Fifth kind of source are tombstone inscriptions. Different kinds of information can be extracted from those. Population censuses, which in parts of the area under discussion began during the 18th century as part of the authorities' attempts to regulate the population. And another important kind of source are betrothal and prenuptial agreements, which specified duties and rights of both parties in a marriage. And signing of such agreements was common practice in the Ashkenazi Jewish society. So I hope I answered your question about the sources, Elisha.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful answer. And I hope it gives our audience a sense of the immense work and diligent scholarship and really just amazing way to give voice to the voiceless. So the next thing I really hope you would go into is tell us what are some of your main findings or the core arguments that you advance in this book so that our audience could get a sense of, after this tremendous welter of sources that you've gone through, what do we come away with?
Okay. So the book is divided into 4 parts, right? In the first part, the first part is dedicated to Agunot, who were chained to their, basically not to their marriage, because they were widows, their husbands died, but they were chained to brothers-in-law, levirate marriage, right? According to the biblical law. And they had to perform or undergo. This is interesting which term to use here. Chalitza, because chalitza is a ceremony that they had to perform in order to be set free, where they take off a sandal of the brother-in-law. I won't go into this now, but it's a ceremony through which they could be set free. By the way, whoever is interested in this, you can go on YouTube and see actual ceremonies of chalitza, because this is a ceremony that still exists, of course. Those women were all widows and whose husbands died childless and had brothers. So I describe what it meant to be a widow, the symbolic and practical aspects, and I trace the prosaic implications that the halakhic requirement of chalitza had on these women's lives. Part 2 of the book focuses on 2 types of tragedies, where the husband is believed dead, but his body has not been found, and where the husband's body has been found, but not identified hasn't been identified according to the halakha. There are a lot of laws pertaining to identifying the dead in these cases. So it deals with stories of women who became agunot as an outcome of a fire that broke out, or their husband drowned, or was murdered, these kinds of things, and women whose husbands died during war or pogroms or other, other catastrophes. Part 3 deals with troubled marriages. So one should know that marital disputes appear regularly in the sources and were in no way rare. So this part concerns women whose husbands abandoned them deliberately. Here I focus on the absconding husbands, on their motives, and on the implications the desertion had on their wives. In part 4, titled The Riddle of the Sources, I examine rabbinic attitudes towards unchaining agunot in attempt to solve the following riddle, which brings us to the core of the arguments I bring forth. While in responsa literature, during the period under discussion, agunot are especially prevalent. As I said, every rabbi who compiled responsa, there's at least one question about an agunah in those compilations. Rabbinic court records register only very few sessions of actually unchaining agunot. So in this 4th section of the book, I offer my explanation for this phenomenon, this difference, thereby presenting some of the main arguments, and here I will, I'll go into the arguments themselves. Okay, Elishav, unless you want to ask something on that.
Yes, no, I think that it's important first to hear what you are arguing before we can argue back.
Okay, great. So first of all, I want to say, it may be stating the obvious, but I've learned that it's not that obvious too. The very existence of the concept of igun, the possibility of a woman becoming agunah, in the consciousness of members of Jewish society, I'd say defined their spheres of action. Whereas men were aware that marriage grants them security, freedom, and control over their wives' fates, women were constantly aware of the lurking threat that the marriage would turn into a trap. Now, I have to say, it's not only my words. Glikel Hamel says that explicitly in her book. She says, when husbands left in the morning, their women were afraid at night. were afraid that they'll become, of course, they were afraid that they'll be murdered, were afraid that, but they were afraid of becoming agunot also. I'll give an example which is very prevalent, very common in the sources. The very possibility of turning a widow into an agunah by postponing her chalitza, yes, basically put every widow of a childless man at risk of extortion. And many widows of childless men were indeed blackmailed, extorted by their brothers-in-law. So, you know, they had to give up assets. They had to give up their, you know, yeah, basically assets, money, in order for the brother to perform chalitza. I'll say something about this later, about this, the relevance of this later too. Here's one of the main arguments I put forth in the book. The meta-narrative, which asserts that rabbis were inclined to unchain agunot, contains several glaring flaws. First of all, it overgeneralizes. It blurs distinct coexisting models of halakhic activities. I'll say more in a minute. It ignores some of the actions and practices that rabbis which dealt with agunot executed, and some actions which imposed great hardships on agunot. And maybe we can discuss this later a little more. The third thing is that this meta-narrative is gender biased, and this is I think a surprising usually it surprises people. The rabbinic assumption is basically that permission to remarry is always the agunah's first choice. That wasn't always the case, which is, I think, interesting. And finally, maybe most important in my, at least in my opinion, is that it attributes to rabbis who dealt with agunot an ethics of preventing suffering where many times no such ethic existed. So I'll say something else about this. There were, in the sources, we can find 4 models. That's how I described it in the book. 4 models of rabbinic attitudes towards, attitudes towards unchaining agunot. Some rabbis openly declared they would never unchain agunot, and at times even went so far as threatening to ban those who did. Other rabbis strongly advocated the necessity of unchaining agunot, and in between, there were rabbis who said, yes, but I'll only do it if so and so, or yes, but I'll only do it if 2 other rabbis agree with me, or this is just a theoretic permission, but I mean, it can't be executed. So there were, it's the idea that all rabbis always did everything they could, which is a very common misconception, is not the way what the sources show. Okay. Unless you want to speak about those, maybe I'll.
So I want to just pause for a minute and maybe
Yes.
ask you to comment on something which seems obvious to you and maybe to me, but may not be obvious to people who are not familiar with the period, which is simply how precarious the life of a woman who was an adult without a man attached to her could be, financially, but also sexually, also socially, in terms of parenting. It isn't the way
Right.
we imagine today, that women could live on their own and could have a satisfactory life without being in some way paired with a man. When we're talking about women who could not remarry, in many cases, we're talking about terrible, life-altering situations in which people really lived on the very boundaries of existence in
Yeah,
so
so
many
first of
ways. So
all,
if you could expand on that a drop.
okay, so first of all, we should know that women weren't legal subjects until they became widows. I mean, which is why, we know more about widows than about any other group of women. Like, I think the historian Ruth Lamdan once called it a passport to freedom, widowhood, because it was the first time a woman became, independent. But basically, as I said before, Jewish societies valued marriage. A woman was, was raised to get married and have children and bring a family. But so basically, since women weren't legal subjects, it was very difficult financially and legally to get along without a man. But I have to say, Glickl Hamel, for instance, says that let me introduce Glickl to those of you who don't know her. Glickl Hamel is a woman, a 17th century woman. She was born in 1645 and died at I think 1724, right, or something,
Correct.
right? At least if I
Yes,
remember correctly.
1724.
And she got married at the age of 12 and had many children. And her husband died when she was about 40, 45. I don't remember exactly now, but I mentioned her in the book. And she remarried. Her first marriage was very happy. Her second marriage was, to judge by her description, pretty miserable. And she says, like, I don't know exactly how I don't remember exactly how she says it, but something like, may God knock some sense into widows' minds so that they won't get married again. So Glickl was well off after her husband died. He left her with enough money. She says she was lucky enough, but even though, I mean, having said that, she did remarry. She was under a lot of pressure and she did remarry. So the basic unit was a married couple. And historically, we know that widows, and especially widows with children, to this day, by the way, are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ranking, right? That's true, still true about most societies. So a woman that is basically in limbo, she's not even, widows received they didn't inherit at the time, but they could collect their ketubah money. And if their husband did give them presents while he was did give them assets, or if they did work with their husbands, they could be better off. An agunah was in limbo. She was in a situation that she couldn't go on with her life, couldn't remarry, which meant it was a very dire situation many, many times. But of course, again, I want to say this, Elisha, it also depended on on her, as always, it depended on her, to which family she belonged and what social class. And so I hope this answers your.
Yeah, I just wanted to step back and thank you for that, to have you comment on why women felt such an urgent desire to be unchained.
So first of all, who says they always did?
Okay, so that's really, these are basic questions
Right.
that I think
So,
need to be asked.
sometimes
Yeah.
I discovered that sometimes there were women who had evidence, who knew that their husbands are dead and did not pursue unchaining, right? So this makes you wonder why. And I think, I don't think we can give one answer that is relevant to all of women, obviously, right? All of these women, but in some cases, it was very difficult to receive permission to remarry, and they couldn't be bothered with dealing with it. I mean, it meant running from one rabbi to the other in search for permission. This cost money. This took time. And so I think that's one thing. Others maybe did not want to remarry. Like I said, like Glico said before. Like I described about what Glico said. But I think, when a woman, first of all, when a woman became an agunah, for instance, if her husband ran away, she was usually, first of all, women were many times blamed as the ones that, as the bad party in the marriage. If she's an agunah, there is a Yiddish saying that says, today, how do you say, careless, today careless, tomorrow an agunah, right? So there was this notion that if a husband ran away, it's probably his wife's fault. So basically, it was better to be married. I mean, socially, I assume, socially. I'm not sure. I don't think we will be able to answer that. In many cases, it was clear that a woman, if she was married to a terrible husband, and we see those in in the chapter about marital disputes. We see women who wanted to separate from their husbands and couldn't care less if the husband was away. But the basic way the society was built was that it was built on couples, right? On married couples.
I was very struck by your argument about how increasingly across this period, rabbis tended to refuse to let their permission for remarriage stand unless their contemporaries concurred with them in their release. And this was something that, if I'm not mistaken, you documented as being less the case in the beginning of the period, but as time went on, it became more so, such that we see an almost social development in the idea of rabbinical networks, insisting that the entire network join them rather than relying on the local rabbi, for example, to say, this is the evidence, these are the people, this is my conclusion. And I was really struck, first of all, by the fact of that growing impediment, because it just meant that a woman, as you said, had to run from one rabbi to another, sometimes across Europe, which was expensive and exhausting and time consuming. And not everybody had the kind of resources that they could pursue that kind of permission. And that leads the book to have a kind of, I would say, critical tone toward the rabbinical establishment of the early modern period. So if you wanted to jump in on some of that.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, this process is very clear in the sources. And what it meant was that it wasn't the local rabbi who might have known the agunah's circumstances, who might have known her husband, who might have known something about their marriage. It wasn't him that she could approach for, or it could be unchained by. Because once he did that, most rabbis asked for at least two other rabbis to agree with them. And the process, which happened less for substantive halakhic reasons and more for reasons like power, reputation, and prestige, and professionalization of the rabbinic establishment. So during this process, it meant that women, like you said, had to, they had to wait for lengthy periods in order to, for answers to come from the rabbis, for the other rabbis, or had to go themselves. We have one rabbi saying, I found one rabbi, Margaliot, right, that he said, I'm not willing to send this woman to run from rabbi to rabbi, because he says, it is difficult for her to drag from place to place. I'm not going to send her. But this is one rabbi that I found that writes such a thing. Most rabbis, even if they get to the conclusion that this woman should be unchained, say, let the rabbi 500 kilometers away agree with me, and another rabbi 600 kilometers away in the other direction should agree with me, because they are the prominent, the well-known rabbis, the Nodabu, right? The great rabbis of the time. And I think this has to do with the rabbinic establishment's quest for monopoly over, over the personal status, especially when Jews started using non-Jewish legal systems also. So, they were trying to keep power in their hands. And I think this is something that women, Agunot, suffered from terribly.
Okay. Thank you, Noah. This has been very fascinating, and I see that there are already quite a number of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask them not necessarily in order, but in the order that I think will shed more light on some of the specifics of your book. Okay, so the first question I want to ask is the last one that appeared here, and that is, how did one determine that there was a situation of Agunot, if that's the correct way to pronounce it? Is it one rabbi? Is there a bet din? Is it proclaimed? Is it announced? Is it the woman's realization? What creates an agunah when a husband is away for a long time, for example, and eventually it becomes clear he's not returning, etc.?
So first of all, in many cases, it was the woman herself who decided, because, as I said before, many men were absent for long times, right? For long periods, right? For months, weeks. And many times it was up to a woman to say, I guess he's not coming back. And I want him declared as dead, or as, I want someone to help me find him, things like that. So many times it was up to him. In other cases, in cases of murder or in cases of war, for instance, one of my favorite cases, they're very sad, but one of the favorite cases, because it brings me back to another argument, is the case about a woman from whose husband dies during the Khmelnytsky massacres, Pa'ot Vetat. And she approached a rabbi. She saw he was dead. She saw and it was clear that, those were terrible uprisings. Thousands of Jews were killed. She saw, and she came to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, but I need proof, halakhic proof, right, that he is dead. And this woman was very assertive, and I tell her story. He ran a test by her, asking her, trying to see if she knows the halakhic material, and if when she testifies, it means he's really dead. But so she was very assertive. So sometimes it depends. There's another case I bring that a woman knew from the French local authorities that her husband was murdered. His body was found, but his body was identified by non-Jewish authorities. And the local rabbi, this is in Metz, did not accept this identification. So this made her an agunah. So there are different cases and different options here, the different ways of becoming an agunah.
Okay. Several of the questions just asked about the boundaries, both geographical and chronological of your book. What parts of Europe you include, which you don't include, and also why you began and ended where you did.
Okay. So as I said, it's like I accepted Jacob Katz, which is the great historian, was the great historian of our period, for the definition of Ashkenaz, because though it is a very wide realm, in terms of marriage customs, Jews basically led their lives in the same way, right? So it was, they exchanged response, the rabbis from all around this realm, but they led their ways basically even though, as I said before, they were governed by different non-Jewish legal systems, Jews lived, when it came to marriage especially, marriage, divorce, and personal status, they were all under the same operated under the same legal system, or the same way. Time-wise, I'll say, the decision to begin after Pa'otachtat is because we know that there is a testimony that following Pa'otachtat, there was a session of the Vad Arba Aratzot, the Council of Four Lands, right, which was high hierarchy, right, legal hierarchy, that they decided a few things specifically about the ways to deal with agunot. We don't have these decisions. We don't have these, right? But we know, at least there's a testimony that there were many agunot and that rabbis did get together to try to solve the problem. And on the other end of the period, starting 1850, we're talking about a story which is different altogether, as there were hundreds of thousands of Jewish men who left Eastern Europe to the Americas, many of whom never sent to call their wives and left them agunot behind. So that's a different story. And so I thought this is an interesting period to deal with. And though it's a long period, I think it's fair to say that there are many aspects which are relevant to the whole, to those 200 years, right?
Okay. I think I can answer this question, but you are the speaker. What proportion of marriages did not have a prenuptial or betrothal agreement?
I don't know.
There are tanaim, there are agreements,
Yes.
but they're not about granting divorces. They're about marital property for the most
No,
part.
so first of all, the prenuptial agreements, some of them, many of them, do relate to the possibility of chalitza,
Chalitza,
right?
yes. but not,
And there are conditional, there are prenuptial agreements that say specifically that should the husband die when they're die childless, his brothers will undergo chalitza without asking money, and if they don't, they'll have to pay a specific sum. There were many problems even in cases when those prenuptial agreements were signed, but that's a different story. At least we know there was such a thing.
Okay, so here's a fascinating question, and I think there was at least one such case that I could think of, a case in which the husband is declared dead and the wife granted permission to remarry, and then the dead husband returns.
So we're talking about Martin Guerre, the famous, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right. I did not find such a case in our sources,
Isn't there a story?
Except for one.
Okay,
Rabbi Yaakov Emden.
that's exactly the one I'm thinking of.
He says that his great-grandmother, who lived in the middle of the 17th century, received testimony that her husband was killed, but nevertheless she did not want to remarry, and eventually he came back. I suspect that Rabbi, and I bring it in a footnote, but I think it's important. Rabbi Yaakov Emden was one of the people. He in his autobiography, he says specifically that he read books about imposters in many languages. Now he was, as people who know this period know, he was basically obsessed with Sabbatianism, right? Shabtaut. And the story of Martin Guerre appears a chapter after the story of Shabtai Tzvi. So I suspect he knew the story, and he didn't say that specifically. So this is really a guess. That's not a scholarly, that let's say that's a guess, but I think it's worth contemplating, this guess that he knew. And I don't know if his story could have been true about his great grandmother, but at least what it meant is that it was threatening for later rabbis. But I didn't find other cases in which something like that happened.
Okay. I don't think we have time for a lot more questions, but several of them are pointing to the question about contemporary agunot, whether there exists such a category beyond Orthodox circles today, and what is being done in whatever circles today to alleviate the dilemma of agunot.
Okay, so first of all, of course, it exists today. The question whether it's beyond Orthodox circles. So first of all, in the state of Israel, for instance, and I'm an Israeli scholar, legal status is, under the authority of the monopoly of the rabbinate. So any woman, there are quite a few agunot, and women's organizations never agree with the rabbinic courts about how many agunot we have, but there are. And this is especially relevant today, for instance, with the cases since October 7, and this is an opportunity to bring this up. Hundreds of soldiers were killed after October 7, many of them young men, childless young men. And every year in Israel, usually there are 15 women who perform chalitza, who have to undergo the ceremony. And following October 7, there were already over 60, I think, or something like the last time I checked. women who had to undergo chalitza. So the rabbinate and some of the women's organizations did try to make the ceremony less humiliating than it is. But the ceremony exists and women do undergo that. And yes, there still are agunot in Israel and around the world today. People who live in Brooklyn know there's a, right? I think there's a woman, a young woman who
Yes.
now is trying to
rally the
fight
community
that.
together. Yes, to fight
Yes.
back. Absolutely. There was one very quick question that I know you can answer in a second about the root of the term aginut.
Right. So that comes from, it appears first in Megillat Ruth, in the book of Ruth. When Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, when they want to follow her to back to Israel, the land of Israel, she says to them, why do you want to be anchored to your dead husbands? That is the first time this word appears.
Yes.
And one more thing, if I may say, Elisheva, before we conclude, that the credit for the beautiful, beautiful piece of art on the cover goes to two women. The brilliant choice was Sylvia Fuchs-Fried's choice. She found this fantastic image. And the artist, which I recommend going on her website, the fantastic artist is Andy Arnovitz, and it's called The Code of Agunot. Go on Andy Arnovitz's website. It's a beautiful piece of work made from pieces of scanned ktubot.
Yes, I highly recommend the book, but in many cases you cannot judge a book by its cover. But in this particular case, I think the cover really adds a new dimension. It's a magnificent work in the shape of a woman's frock or dress. But when you look at it closely, it is hundreds probably of small pieces of ktubot, right?
Right.
Is that, yes.
Scanned from the National Library in Israel, right?
An absolutely fantastic work of art. So thank you so much, Noah, for this absolutely illuminating and wonderful presentation, again, about a difficult and heartbreaking topic. And on that happy note, we wish everybody a Chag Sameach, Hazis Pesach, and may we have a resolution to so many of the world's confusions, including these.